Goeiedag en hartlik welkom by Regheid met Robinson hier op Litnet. Suid-Afrika is vinnig besig om die watergrens te bereik. Dis die stadium dat waterverbruik die minimumperk vir menslike behoeftes oorskry. Dit kan lei tot 'n mislukte staat. Die land sal dringend moet leer om beter dinge te doen met die min water wat oor is. So sê ons gas, professor Anthony Turton van die Sentrum vir Omgewingsbestuur van die Universiteit van die Vrystaat. Hy word alreeds beskou as een van die land se voorste waterkenners. Professor, since when have you been warning about this crisis imminent in the water sector?
I started raising the flags in 2008, first in a conference, an Africa Day conference that was hosted at UNISA, and then subsequently in a keynote address that I was scheduled to give at the CSIR at a conference called Science, Real and Relevant.
Since then, why didn't the government listen?
What we were finding at that point in time was that the whole scientific discourse had become highly politicized. It was generally not sort of played out in the public, but there were these grand schemes that were being rolled out that were generally devoid of any scientific basis. And I was a fellow at that point in time, and there were other fellows as well that were also increasingly alarmed at what they were witnessing. So I felt at that point in time that I'm a person that subscribes to the Russell-Einstein Manifesto, which basically dictates that good scientists must have a moral conscience, and I felt it was my responsibility to basically speak up for what the scientific facts were telling us, because that ultimately is the role of the organization that I represented at the time, which was to advise government on the science, engineering and technology foundation needed for the country.
Now, these grand schemes, did you ever get the impression that they were designed specifically for cadre deployment and for buddies?
Well, I can't say that, but they were untethered from reality, and we see that happening now. I can give examples in the water sector, where the National Water Resource Strategy #1 that came out in 2002, that made it very clear that South Africa had allocated 98% of all the water we have available in the country. And now 98% is as close to 100% as we can realistically measure. But subsequent to that, we've realized that the technical foundation for those calculations were slightly flawed, and they've now been improved. And we now realize that the amount of water we have available has been revised down from 53 billion cubic meters of water per annum down to 48. That's ascribed to an improvement in the mathematical algorithms or whatever. So the reality is that we've allocated as much water as we have available, as close as we can accurately measure. But then we get to a situation where National Water Resource Strategy #2, which comes out years later, uses exactly the same data as Resource Strategy #1, but then calls for things like doubling of agriculture. Now, agriculture takes 60% of the total water budget in the country. So in other words, these things are ideologically determined, they are aspirational in nature, but they're not tethered in any reality. So therefore, that raised the question of what is the role of science in this process? Is science there to give a counterbalance? Is science there to give a realistic insight into what the limitations are? So we had a very, very big internal debate, and as a result of that internal debate, we decided to launch a program, and that program resulted in the publication of a textbook, a university textbook called Governance as a Trilogue, Government, Society and Science in Transition, of which I was the editor. And the purpose of that textbook was to help us as scientists to understand in a new democracy what our role was. Was our role to advise government on what their intentions were, or was our role to advise society on what the implications of this were? And that resulted in a number of very important decisions being made. And one of them was that we need to start engaging with the media more, because the media plays a very important role as an intermediary between the complexities of science and the average citizen. And that's really when I started to go into that media domain, because I was appointed at that point in time, sent for media training, and I became the official spokesperson for water at the CSIR at that time. So that's the long and the short of this evolution.
Do you personally believe that this water crisis can be worse than the electricity crisis?
Well, it's different. We know it's not a question of better or worse. It's a question of fundamentally different. Now, what we've learned from the energy crisis is that society has managed to adapt, and they've adapted by getting off grid wherever they can, and that has resulted in unintended consequences. One being the exacerbation of an unequal society, because those that can afford to do it so have done so, and those that can't haven't. So now it's slightly different in water, and we see it playing out in the water crisis, where we're getting policies that are being implemented that are, I dare say, generally, let's just say, not mindful of the hydraulic realities of water and pipe systems. And here I'm referring now to the policy of water shifting, because water shifting, in my view, is simply an admission that the system has failed. Because once you start water shifting as a deliberate policy, it suggests that the framers of that policy were really uninformed about the implications of a changing pressure regime in what should be a normally pressurized system. And we can get into details of that if you've got time for that. But what it essentially means is that pressurized systems are designed to be operated in a certain way. And part of that is not like load shedding, where you can just switch it on and off. Electricity is consists of electrons. Water consists of molecules, and molecules behave differently to electrons. So there's a very fundamental difference between the two. So it's those nuances and those sort of realities that have not been brought up into our policy, and that's ultimately left many of the scientists quite deeply perplexed about what their own future careers were and what they ought to do to survive under those circumstances.
Where is the situation the worst in the country?
Well, I think the situation is the worst probably in the metros. And if you really want to home into it, we can give a great example of a successful metro and then an unsuccessful metro, and then in between. Now, clearly, to me, the most successful metro right now has got to be the city of Cape Town, where they've been through their crisis of day zero in 2019, 2018, thereabouts. They took a lot of flack for that, but they've now really learned their lesson, and they've turned the ship around, and they've come up with absolutely world-class policy decisions about water security. So there's a good news story in Cape Town. It's the city of Cape Town. But now, at the same time as that's playing out, we have the exact opposite playing out in Durban, eThekwini, where eThekwini has effectively become a failed metro. Part of the failure is the inability to deliver water services. But this is happening at the very same time that the mayor of Durban has recently voted for himself the largest salary increase of any of the mayors in the metros, I'm led to believe, a package close to 4 million rand per annum. So there's a complete disconnection between the reality on the ground and the packages and benefits that are paid by the state, by the taxpayer, to sustain these cadres. Now, in between that, we've now got this thing playing out in Gauteng, where you've got 3 metros. And the significance of that is that those 3 metros are home to probably 60% of the total manufacturing capability of the country. That's just a rounded out number. I don't know what the exact number is. But that is, those 3 metros are sustained by one water board, Rand Water, where there's recently been an assassination of key of senior executives. And at the very same time, that Rand Water Board is now taking on board onto its balance sheet a substantial and growing debt from various municipalities. And while this is happening, there's an apparent inability of the regulator to intervene because they cite a clause in the Constitution known as the Cooperative Governance Clause. And that Cooperative Governance Clause says that one tier of government may not interfere with another tier or sphere of government, which now, of course, raises the question of, is this a constitutional limitation to the role of a regulator? And if so, how can that logically be left unchecked and uncorrected? So these are the sort of realities of the background that we're facing. And so, yes, we see now the very real probability that Johannesburg might come under growing stress in the near future, and it's not impossible. that they follow a similar trajectory to Durban. That's why it's so important that we have really cool heads at the moment around the table with, really understanding these technical realities with the ear of decision makers that trust them. And that's the problem. There's no trust. The trust has been eroded. This is probably our single biggest problem.
Are we approaching the water barrier? And perhaps you can just explain what it means, the water barrier, and where does it come from?
The water barrier came from a very interesting Swedish scientist named Malin Falkenmark. And she did some work in the 1970s or thereabouts, where she was doing a PhD at the time. And she asked a simple question: is there a finite number of people that a given unit of water can sustain? It was kind of a Malthusian concept, if you like. And she just asked the question, and she did a global study, a very high confidence global study, where she looked at every country in the world. And she looked at the total population of that country, and then she looked at the total water resource availability. And she did some simple mathematical calculations. And she came to the conclusion that if you want to compare apples to apples, she created what is known as a conceptual flow unit, which is 1 million 1 million liters per annum. And that's a flow unit. And she came to the conclusion that there's no empirical evidence of any society retaining social cohesion as you go beyond what she called the water barrier, which is 2,000 people per flow unit. Now, we in the CSIR at that time, we took that very seriously. I was very close to Malin Falkenmark. I used to work in my own PhD. And in fact, I was invited out to the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences as part of a Lifetime Achievement Award for Malin, as part of the relationship that I had with it. But we decided to use Marlin's work in the CSIR to help us to understand where the hotspots in South Africa were. And we converted her concepts from national level down into river basin level, which is technically a very complex a mathematical process to go through. But nonetheless, we did that. And we found, to our great surprise, that there are parts of South Africa that are more than double what Malin Falkenmark said is the water barrier. And those areas are mostly up in the Limpopo area. So the northern parts of South Africa, where we have all sorts of water resource constraints, but mostly centered on water that comes from the Limpopo River Basin. So yes, this is a very, very important concept, and it indicates to us that we are reaching finite limits in certain parts of the country. But it's not a doom and gloom scenario, because what her work found is that with technical sophistication and with the introduction of recycling technologies and that kind of thing, you can have technically advanced societies surviving beyond the water barrier. But the important thing that one needs to be noted there is that you have to invest heavily in science, engineering, and technology. That's the important thing. And if you look now at what's happened in South Africa, we've disinvested from science, engineering, and technology, and our institutions that deliver those type of products or support base are under severe pressure, to the extent that, for example, we no longer really have any significant national programs of water management. We no longer have, for example, the National Eutrophication Program that is designed to manage the blue-green algae in our rivers and dams that arise from sewage contamination. That program is underfunded. The number of technically competent people involved is diminishing. Many of them are migrating out to other places, etc. So this happens at the same time as there's just been some discoveries now in the not too distant past of new species of cyanobacteria in South Africa. And peer-reviewed science has indicated that those new species are potentially quite harmful, because we don't fully understand the implications of their toxin. We don't understand the full chemistry of their toxins, etc. But indications are that these are more adaptable than the current species of blue-green algae. So in other words, to summarize, there's a lot that we don't know. In other words, we don't know what it is that we don't know. And that now becomes a very, very alarming thing for South Africa.
Okay, and that brings us perhaps to the horrible story of the Vaal and the water lettuce. If you can just give us your impression of that.
Yeah, so the Vaal is a story of eutrophication, and our eutrophication is what happens when a water body is enriched with nutrients. And typically nutrients are either phosphate and nitrate, two chemical products that are very often associated either with agricultural runoff or with sewage. And it's those two things, nitrogen and phosphate, the chemistry of those two things that's important. Now, where we found this the most acute in South Africa has been Hartbeespoort Dam. And that Hartbeespoort Dam is probably the most studied dam in the country, with at least 50 years worth of really good science coming out of the Hartbeespoort Dam. So we can say that Hartbeespoort Dam has taken, let's call it 5 decades to get to what it is today. A few years ago, maybe 2 years ago, I published something on Facebook in which I raised the alarm once again. It was a photograph showing the Vaal River becoming highly eutrophic, just like Hartbeespoort Dam. And I then suggested that if we don't get on top of this thing very, very soon, we're going to see a rapid change in the Vaal Dam. So what happens now is that we find that in 2021, March of 2021, the first photograph was taken of a single water lettuce on the Vaal River. A single water lettuce, and I've got a copy of that photograph. It was sent to me by one of the scientists in Rand Water, and that single photograph was fed to his team, and he raised the alarm. He went and did the inspection on it, and they started to develop a strategy on how to deal with it. But we now know that by about October, November of 2023, that water lettuce was out of control. So from 2021 until 2023, the situation in the Vaal had changed in such a radical way that literally in 36 months, the Vaal River became as complicated as Hartbeespoort Dam took 50 years to change. So in other words, from a scientific perspective, I came to the conclusion that we are seeing an acceleration in the rate of change of these aquatic ecosystems. And that accelerated rate of change is of such a magnitude that it is overwhelming our institutional capabilities to deal with it. And when I say that overwhelming the institutional capabilities, for example, there was very little known about water lettuce in the scientific literature. So the pesticides that are used to control it, of which glyphosate is one, was not registered for the use of water lettuce. But yet, even in the face of the fact that there was no legal registration for glyphosate for water lettuce, it was still used. It was still authorized by certain officials. Now that in and of itself to me is a manifestation of the fact that the institution is unable to cope with the rate of change. So this is where we are today in South Africa. Rand Water is under severe financial distress for reasons of its own. On top of that, we've now got institutional distresses, and this is happening at a time when change is occurring so fast, and we are losing skilled people that ought to be there in a decision support base. And that, of course, is nothing more than a continuation of the way that we started out this interview today. When I told you about how the origin in 2007 and the original National Water Resource Strategy #1, which came out in 2002. So the narrative I've told you now is really consistent with that whole thing. Ultimately, it's about the loss of skills, the inability as a society to allocate sufficient resources for research, for the development of technologies, for the qualification of scientists, engineering, and technologists. We just don't have enough of those people that are appropriately trained, and that could be at any university, it could be at any of the national science councils. It is a national problem as far as I'm concerned.
Now, as we approach the water barrier, is there a possibility that the situation can get out of hand and we can become a failed state?
I believe that the rate of change is accelerating. I believe that the rate of change is now going so fast that it is overwhelming the institutional capacity to cope. And I give an example of that. I was called in some time ago to act as an expert witness, for want of a better word, in a legal case over the Rooiwal sewage works, the Rooiwal wastewater treatment works. And what we found there was that Rooiwal was unable to self-correct, in part because the legal requirement for procurement of services was of such a complex nature that it could not roll them out fast enough to deal with the crisis at hand. And that's when I really first became aware of the fact that the rate of change is overwhelming the institutional capacity. So I think that is happening now across the board. We're likely to see it happening in more and more places. And unless we wake up as a nation and depoliticize this problem and stop pointing fingers at each other, and we mobilize a team of technically competent individuals that are able to give advice under these very difficult circumstances. Unless we do that, I'm afraid to say that the future is going to increasingly be dominated by systems failing. So I believe that we are, in fact, a failed state or a failing state. And when I say a failing state, I use a definition of state failure, which I started working on in about 2008, around about that time, a little bit before, at that Africa Day conference I spoke about early on in the interview. And I refer to state failure as the inability of an organ of government to convert signals coming from its operational environment into actionable, adequately resourced responses to mitigate the problem that those signals are alluding to. So think of it as the ability to self-correct. And our ability to self-correct is clearly not functional. And I give examples of that would be now the policy of water shedding, because water shedding, once again, all that does is it simply exacerbates the problem. It accelerates the rate of failure of infrastructure. So that input-output model, the inability to adequately resource appropriate solutions, that's our problem. And I've come to the conclusion now that we've got inappropriate solutions being applied to inadequately designed problems, inadequately diagnosed problems.
Yes, so the point in between, the Minister Mtunu went to Limpopo a week or two ago, and he said the solution for that region is water from Zimbabwe. Do you believe that?
Well, Zimbabwe is part of the same hydrological regime. The water that comes from the Zimbabwe portion of the Limpopo is part of the Limpopo River. It's the same climate. It's the same hydrological cycle. And, I would say personally that is another indictment of our inability to respond. For decades, for more than a century, we've supplied, for even longer than that, South Africa supplied water to the town of Messina. So now suddenly we've admitted that we are unable to do that. So these are all admissions of a failure of the system. So, this is not a malicious conclusion that I've drawn. I'm not pointing fingers, in anger or anything like that. I'm just saying that what I'm seeing as a scientist, I'm seeing empirical evidence of failure. And failure of the state has got implications for every single citizen. And unless we wake up as citizens and do the necessary thing insofar as we can, then I'm afraid we're going to increasingly face dire consequences.
What is the role of climate change?
Climate change has got a role to play, but in my honest opinion at the moment, I think climate change is less relevant to our immediate problems. I would argue that our most pressing problem at the moment is our inability to manage our sewage. We produce 7 billion liters of sewage every single day. And approximately let's round it out to say 80% of that is returned to our rivers and dams in an untreated or at best a partially treated format. Now, as logical, rational people, we can ask a simple question. How long can we continue to inundate our rivers and dams with raw sewage like this without expecting human health implications, without expecting consequences to arise? The fact that we've managed to get this far with relatively few casualties, to me, is quite an achievement, I think. But I don't think we can continue to dodge the bullet much further. And when I talk about state failure, let me just say something else in this context. The essence of the National Water Act, which was the first piece of legislation brought in a democratic dispensation, driven entirely by the ANC, first piece of significant legislation. The whole purpose of the National Water Act was to rehabilitate our rivers and dams because it was designed to prevent them from becoming open sewers. And the fact that very high confidence work using satellite images was published in about 2015, thereabouts 2017, around about that period of time, which indicated very clearly that more than 60% of our dams in South Africa are now eutrophic. In other words, they like Hartbeespoort Dam. Now, that is an empirical indicator that the objective of the National Water Act has not been met. So in other words, if we can't implement the National Water Act, it has failed. And if that has failed, that the foundation of our water resource management is either inappropriate or not being applied or not being implemented, and therefore has to be changed, but it's just an indicator that things are wrong. So if we carry on and pretend that maybe someday we're going to face a crisis in the future, I think that is disingenuous. We are in the crisis now. It is here now. The likelihood of job losses in the manufacturing sector, in the metros, the 3 metros in Gauteng, in the, let's call it, the next 6 months is now. It's here. So that's where we are.
Is it possible to recorrect the system?
Yes, I'm an eternal optimist, and the reason why we are in this dilemma is simply because it is just that. It's a dilemma. We are facing a water management dilemma, and a dilemma is something for which there are no apparent solutions because all alternatives are equally unpleasant. That's why one sits on the horns of a dilemma. Our role as scientists is to understand that dilemma and break it down into a series of problems, because problems by definition can be solved. So problems, we need to break it down into a series of problems, and then we need to start diagnosing those problems correctly and then applying appropriate solution to adequately diagnosed problems. And that's what we've got to start doing. And that can happen literally from tomorrow if that's what we decide that as a nation, that's what we're going to do.
And where will you start in a very practical sense to actually get things on a positive road?
Look, there is a lot of activity happening behind the scenes. I mean, for example, I have a very good relationship with the minister, and I have a very good relationship with the deputy minister, and this goes back a long period of time. So there is an enormous amount of goodwill in that space. I've also got a very good relationship with the different funders, with the financial community. And in fact, tomorrow I'm on my way up to a conference, an event in Johannesburg that will be, I will be on a panel alongside the Director General of Water Affairs. And what we're looking at now is the future of how to fund the rehabilitation of the water sector, because it's very clear that the economy is crashing at such a rate that the flow of taxes into the system is unable to correct the system. We need, for example, something like, the original number I knew was 1 trillion rand. Recently, the president has spoken about 3 trillion rand. So let's just say it's more than 1 trillion rand that is needed just to fix what's broken in the water sector. And there's no way that we're going to get that from the taxpayer, the taxpayer. So we're going to have to start looking at alternative sources of funding. And I'm involved in an international effort to do just that. And we are looking now at very interesting and innovative financing mechanisms. And part of that is the creation of credits, water credits that are traded and that are capable of actually raising capital for the improvement of things, for example, like a wastewater treatment works or a water treatment plant. So this is something that's not yet in South Africa. It's something that's happening out there. It's got traction in different parts of the world. But I think this will be accelerated in South Africa now as we really look down the barrel of a gun into this very serious national crisis that we face.
Professor, thank you very much. Great talking to you. Good luck.
It's a pleasure. Thank you very much.